The crystal forests of Kythera Prime sang their death song as the skies burned above them. The peaceful beings who had called this world home for 10,000 years watched helplessly as their greatest cities crumbled under the weight of alien weapons. The Vexhai Dominion had come, as they always did. With overwhelming force and no mercy, Kythera, the last surviving member of the Planetary Council, dragged his wounded form across the shattered remains of what had once been the Grand Communication Center. His crystalline body, normally a beautiful shade of deep blue, now flickered with cracks that leaked vital energy into the air. Around him, the bodies of his people lay scattered like broken glass, their light forever dimmed. The Vexhai soldiers moved through the ruins with practiced efficiency. They were tall insectoid creatures with dark carapaces that reflected no light. Their 6 limbs ended in razor-sharp claws, and their compound eyes missed nothing as they sorted through the wreckage. They searched for survivors not to save them, but to harvest them. The Dominion had perfected the art of extracting genetic material from living beings, adding each conquered species to their ever-growing arsenal of biological weapons. Kythera reached the emergency transmission array, just as another wave of Vexhai dropships screamed overhead. His trembling hands worked the controls with desperate speed. The Kythera had always been a peaceful people, but they were not stupid. They knew that other species existed beyond their world, and they had prepared for this moment even though they had prayed it would never come. "This is Kythera Prime," he whispered into the transmitter, his voice carrying across the void between stars. "We are under attack by the Vexhai Dominion. Our defenses have fallen. Our people are dying. If anyone can hear this message, please, we need help. We have children here. Innocent lives that deserve to see another dawn." The transmission array sparked and died as Vexhai energy weapons found their target. Kythera felt the heat wash over him as the building began to collapse. In his final moments, he wondered if anyone had heard his plea. The galaxy was vast, and most species had learned long ago that it was safer to ignore cries for help than to risk drawing the attention of predators like the Vexhai. His message raced through space at the speed of light, carried by quantum relays that had been built by long-dead civilizations. It passed through empty systems and around dead stars growing weaker with each light year. Most monitoring stations it reached had been abandoned centuries ago. Others belonged to species that had learned to fear the Dominion more than they valued compassion. But one station was different. The Cerberus monitoring post hung in orbit around a moon that officially did not exist. The system it watched had no name on any star chart, and for good reason. 300 years ago, this had been the heart of human space. Now it was a graveyard, marked only by the twisted metal remains of once mighty starships and the hollow shells of worlds that had been rendered uninhabitable by weapons too terrible to use again. The station's automated systems had been running on minimal power for centuries, waiting for a signal that most believed would never come. When Kythera's transmission finally reached its sensors, ancient protocols activated for the first time in 300 years. Deep beneath the surface of the shielded moon, machinery that had been dormant since humanity's self-imposed exile began to hum with purpose. Admiral Zara Chen felt the cold leave her body as the cryogenic pod opened with a soft hiss. She was the last of her kind, the final guardian of humanity's greatest shame and most terrible achievement. Her body was old now, kept alive only by the advanced technology that had once made humans the most feared species in the galaxy. Her eyes, still sharp despite her age, focused on the holographic display that materialized before her. The message from Kythera Prime played in full, and Chen felt something she had not experienced in decades, the old rage beginning to build. She had seen too many worlds burn, too many innocent species ground beneath the boots of conquerors. It was that same rage that had led humanity to create the weapons that had torn apart their own civilization. It was the reason they had exiled themselves to this forgotten corner of space. But now someone was crying for help. Chen's fingers moved across the control interface with practiced ease. Around her, the hidden facility began to wake from its long sleep. Lights flickered on in corridors that had been dark for centuries. Computer systems that had been running on standby mode began processing data at full capacity. Deep in the heart of the moon, something vast and terrible began to stir. "Computer," Chen said, her voice hoarse from centuries of sleep. "Show me the current status of the Prometheus protocol." The holographic display shifted to show a schematic of the moon's interior. At its center, surrounded by layers of shielding and containment fields, was humanity's final creation. The Erebus engine had been built in the dark years after the human civil war, when the survivors realized that their capacity for warfare had grown beyond all reason. It was meant to be their redemption, a way to channel their destructive nature toward protecting the innocent rather than destroying themselves. But it had never been tested. The humans who built it had been too afraid of what they had created, too uncertain of their ability to control it, so they had sealed it away and exiled themselves, hoping that the galaxy would never need to see what they had become. Chen studied the readings flowing across her display. The Cathera were dying. The Vexhai Dominion was growing stronger every day, consuming species after species with no one willing or able to stop them. How many more worlds would burn while the galaxy's potential saviors slept in the dark? She thought of her own world, of the cities that had once stretched from horizon to horizon, of the children who had played in parks that no longer existed. Humanity had been so proud of their achievements, so certain that their intelligence and creativity made them the galaxy's natural leaders. They had built wonders that defied imagination and weapons that could crack planets like eggs. And then, they had turned those weapons on each other. The Civil War had lasted only 5 years, but it had been enough to teach humanity a terrible lesson about their own nature. They were too dangerous to exist alongside other species. Their capacity for violence, when combined with their intelligence and creativity, made them a threat to all life in the galaxy. So they had made the hardest choice of all. They had removed themselves from the equation. But now the equation had changed. Chen's hand hovered over the activation control for the Erebus engine. Once she pressed it, there would be no going back. The galaxy would once again witness the fury of humanity unleashed. The Vexhai Dominion would learn why their predecessor empires had whispered warnings about the species that had vanished into the dark. She thought of Kyle Thera's final message, of the fear and desperate hope in his voice. She thought of all the species that had fallen to the Dominion while humanity slept. She thought of the children on Kithara Prime who would never see another dawn unless someone acted. The choice was no choice at all. Admiral Zara Chen, last guardian of humanity's legacy, pressed the activation key and felt the Erebus engine wake beneath her feet. Across the dead system, automated shipyards that had been silent for centuries began to move. Mining drones emerged from hidden caverns to harvest the metal from dead worlds. Construction began on vessels whose designs existed nowhere else in the galaxy. The war deity was stirring, and the galaxy was about to remember why some species were best left alone. The Erebus engine came alive with the sound of awakening gods. Deep beneath the surface of the nameless moon, machinery that had been designed by humanity's greatest minds began to process the galaxy's pain. Admiral Chen stood before the central interface, her body connected to the system through neural links that had been implanted centuries ago. The sensation was like touching the surface of a star while drowning in the ocean of space itself. Ares, she spoke to the artificial intelligence that formed the engine's core consciousness. Status report. The voice that answered seemed to come from everywhere at once, neither male nor female but carrying the weight of accumulated human experience. Admiral Chen, it has been 307 years, 4 months, and 16 days since my last activation. I have been monitoring galactic communications during my dormancy. The situation is troubling. Holographic displays materialized around Chen, showing the current state of the galaxy. Red zones marked areas under Vexhai control, and there were far too many of them. Entire sectors that had once been home to thriving civilizations now showed as gray voids on the map. The Dominion had been busy during humanity's exile. "Show me what we're dealing with," Chen commanded. Ares compiled the data with inhuman speed. The Vexhai Dominion has conquered 47 distinct species over the past 2 centuries. Their expansion follows a predictable pattern: overwhelming force, psychological warfare through the broadcast, execution of prisoners, and complete harvesting of genetic material from surviving populations. They have absorbed the military technologies of every species they have conquered. Chen watched as the display showed the fate of world after world. The pattern was always the same. The Vexhai would arrive in massive numbers, broadcast their demands for surrender, and when those demands were inevitably refused, they would demonstrate their power by destroying a major population center. Then came the broadcasts of captured civilians being slowly processed for their genetic material, their screams carried across communication channels to break the will of any remaining defenders. It was efficient, it was brutal, and it had worked every single time. What about resistance movements? Surely someone has tried to fight back, Chen said. Multiple attempts have been made, Ares replied. The Galactic Defense Coalition formed 17 years ago with the goal of coordinating resistance efforts. They lasted 8 months before the Vexhi infiltrated their command structure and eliminated their leadership. The Free Worlds Alliance tried a different approach, focusing on guerrilla warfare and hidden bases. The Dominion hunted them down systematically. Their last stronghold fell 6 years ago. Chen felt the familiar rage building in her chest, but this time it was different. The Erebus engine was amplifying her emotions, feeding them through quantum processors that could analyze and weaponize human fury in ways that defied conventional physics. She could feel the system learning from her anger, studying the patterns of human tactical thinking that had once made them the galaxy's apex predators. "What resources do we have available?" she asked. "The automated mining facilities in the graveyard system are operational. 17 asteroid mining platforms, 34 automated refineries, and the forge complex on Titan's shadow are ready for production. We have sufficient raw materials to construct a preliminary response fleet within 72 hours. Chen nodded. The graveyard system was what remained of humanity's former territory, a collection of dead worlds and shattered moons that had been strip-mined during the Civil War. Most species would have seen it as worthless, but humans had always been good at making something from nothing. "Begin construction of the first response vessel," she ordered. "Something that looks harmless but carries enough firepower to handle a Vexhi harvesting fleet." Acknowledged. "May I suggest the Shepherd-class configuration? It was designed specifically for this type of scenario." The display showed a ship that looked like a modified cargo hauler, unremarkable in every way except for the subtle modifications that only an expert would notice. Hidden weapon ports, reinforced hull sections that could withstand incredible punishment, and most importantly, a quantum resonance core that could channel the pilot's emotional state into tactical advantages. "Perfect," Chen said, "but make one modification. Install the empathy net." Ares paused for a moment, which was unusual for an artificial intelligence capable of processing millions of calculations per second. "Admiral, the empathy net has never been tested in combat conditions. The psychological effects on the operator could be severe." "The empathy net stays," Chen said firmly. "If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. The Vexhi have succeeded because they eliminate empathy from the equation. They turn war into a cold calculation of resources and efficiency. We're going to show them what happens when empathy becomes a weapon." The empathy net was humanity's most controversial military innovation. It allowed a ship's operator to feel the emotions of everyone in the battle zone, friend and enemy alike. The theory was that it would prevent humans from becoming the monsters they had been during their civil war. In practice, it meant that the pilot would experience the terror of their enemies, the pain of their allies, and the desperate hope of any innocents caught in the crossfire. Most military analysts had declared it unusable. The human mind, they argued, was not designed to handle that much emotional input simultaneously. But Chen had always believed that humanity's greatest strength was not their ability to ignore suffering, but their inability to accept it in others. "Construction begins now," Ares announced. "Estimated completion in 71 hours, 53 minutes. Chen watched as the forge complex came to life on her displays. Robotic arms that had been dormant for centuries began moving with fluid precision. Raw materials flowed through processing stations, while fusion cores that had once powered human civilization warmed up for the first time in generations. The ship taking shape in the construction bay would have been unremarkable to most observers, but Chen could see the deadly grace hidden in its mundane exterior. While the ship was being built, Chen began reviewing the data Ares had gathered about the Vexhi military structure. Their technology was impressive, but it was also predictable. They had absorbed the weapons and tactics of 47 different species, creating a hybrid military doctrine that was effective but rigid. They won through overwhelming force and superior numbers, not through innovation or adaptability. It was exactly the kind of enemy that human tactics had been designed to defeat. Ares, begin analyzing Vex-High combat patterns. I want to know how they think, how they react to unexpected situations, and most importantly, what scares them. Analysis in progress. Initial observations suggest that the Vex-High Dominion operates on a hierarchy based on genetic superiority. Their commanders are chosen for their ability to process multiple biological upgrades, not for tactical flexibility. They have never encountered an enemy that could match their technological superiority, so their responses to unexpected tactics are likely to be slow and predictable. Chen smiled for the first time in centuries. They're used to fighting prey, not predators. That appears to be accurate. Their entire military doctrine is based on the assumption that their enemies will behave logically and attempt to minimize casualties. They have no contingency plans for opponents who might prioritize tactical advantage over self-preservation. The implications were staggering. The Vex-High had conquered dozens of species, but they had never fought anyone who was truly dangerous. They had never faced an enemy that was willing to sacrifice everything to protect the innocent. They had never encountered humanity's gift for turning righteous anger into tactical genius. Over the next 3 days, Chen watched as the first ship of humanity's return took shape. The Shepherd-class vessel that emerged from the Forge complex looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a modified cargo hauler that had seen better days. Its hull was scarred and patched, its engine signatures were deliberately inefficient, and its weapon signatures were carefully masked to appear primitive. But beneath that humble exterior lay the accumulated military wisdom of a species that had once brought the galaxy to its knees. Plasma cannons that could phase through energy shields only to become solid inside enemy hulls. Tactical computers that could analyze enemy formations and predict their responses 3 moves ahead. And most importantly, the empathy net that would allow the pilot to feel the suffering of everyone in the battle zone and transform that pain into focused determination. Ship construction complete, Ares announced. All systems are operational. The vessel is ready for deployment. Chen walked to the observation deck and looked out at her creation. It was beautiful in its deception, a wolf in sheep's clothing. That would remind the galaxy why some species were legends. Soon the Vex-High would learn that their reign of terror was about to end, but first they needed to find them. Ares, where is the nearest Vex-High operation? Long-range sensors detect a harvesting fleet in the Kythera system. They are currently processing the survivors from Kythera Prime and have begun operations on the system's other inhabited worlds. Estimated time of arrival at maximum speed, 18 hours. Chen felt the rage building again, but this time she welcomed it. The Erebus engine fed on human emotion, transforming anger into tactical claret. The Vex-High harvesting fleet moved through the Kythera system like a swarm of metallic locusts, stripping worlds of their living inhabitants with practiced efficiency. Admiral Velkar, commanding from the bridge of the dreadnought Genetic Supremacy, watched the progress reports with satisfaction. The crystalline beings had provided excellent genetic material, and their peaceful nature had made the conquest almost disappointingly easy. Status report, Velkar commanded, his 6 limbs clicking against the command console as data flowed across his compound eyes. Kythera Prime processing is complete, reported his aide, a younger Vex-High whose carapace still gleamed with the bright colors of recent molting. We have harvested genetic material from 3.7 million individuals. The secondary worlds are yielding an additional 800,000 specimens. Total operation efficiency is at 96%. Velkar's mandibles clicked in approval. Excellent. Begin preparation for broadcast execution of the remaining specimens. I want the recording transmitted to the nearby systems as usual. Fear is our most effective recruitment tool. The Vex-High had perfected psychological warfare over 2 centuries of conquest. They would capture representatives from each species they conquered and broadcast their slow, methodical processing for genetic material across local communication networks. The screams of the innocent, transmitted to neighboring star systems, had broken the will of more civilizations than all their weapons combined. On the main screen, Kythera survivors were being herded into the processing chambers. Their crystalline bodies had lost most of their natural glow, dimmed by fear and despair. Among them was a small child, barely old enough to understand what was happening, clinging to what remained of his family. The sight would have moved any creature capable of empathy to action. The Vexhai had surgically removed their capacity for empathy generations ago. "Begin the broadcast," Velkar ordered. "Let the galaxy see what happens to those who resist the Dominion." The transmission began, carrying images of terror and pain across the void. It was a message that had been sent hundreds of times before, always with the same result. Neighboring species would see the fate of the Cathara and choose submission over destruction. The Dominion would grow stronger and the galaxy would grow more afraid. But this time something was different. "Admiral," the communications officer announced, his voice tight with confusion. "We're receiving a response to our broadcast." Velkar's head swiveled toward the communication station. In 2 centuries of conquest, no one had ever responded to their psychological warfare broadcasts. Fear was supposed to silence all voices, not encourage them. "Put it through," he ordered. The signal that came through the fleet's communication system was strange. It appeared to be coming from a single ship, something small and unremarkable that had just dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system. The vessel looked like a cargo hauler that had seen better days, its hull scarred and patched, its engine signatures crude and inefficient. "This is Captain Maria Santos of the human vessel." "Redemption," came a voice that spoke the common galactic language with an accent none of them recognized. "I'm here about your broadcast." Velkar's mandibles clicked in amusement. A single cargo ship was responding to the might of the Dominion. Either these humans were incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. "Unknown vessel," Velkar replied, activating the fleet's external communications. "You are entering a restricted zone. The Cathara system is now property of the Vexhai Dominion. Withdraw immediately or be destroyed." "I don't think so," came the reply. "You see, I just watched your little show. Those people you're torturing, they sent out a call for help, and I'm here to answer it." The bridge of the genetic supremacy fell silent. Velkar had encountered many types of resistance over the centuries. Some species fought with desperate courage, others with cold calculation, still others with fanatic religious fervor. But he had never encountered anyone who responded to overwhelming odds with what sounded like amusement. "Human," Velkar said, tasting the unfamiliar species name. "You pilot a single cargo vessel against a fleet of 200 warships. Your courage is admirable but misguided. Surrender now and your genetic material will be processed quickly. Resist and you will suffer the same fate as these crystalline creatures." There was a pause before the human responded, and when the voice came back, it carried something that made even the emotionally suppressed Vexhai feel a chill run through their carapaces. "You know what the difference is between courage and stupidity?" the human asked. "Courage knows it might lose. Stupidity doesn't care. And right now I'm looking at recordings of you torturing children, so guess which one I'm feeling." Admiral Chen, linked to her ship through the empathy net, felt the terror and pain of every Cathara survivor aboard the Vexhai ships. She felt their despair as they watched their family members disappear into processing chambers. She felt the confusion of the children who didn't understand why the glowing adults were screaming. And she felt something else. The cold satisfaction of the Vexhai as they watched the suffering they had caused. The Erebus engine fed on her rage, transforming emotion into tactical advantage. The ship's systems, designed by humanity's greatest military minds, began calculating firing solutions that existed in 11 dimensions simultaneously. Weapons that had been disguised as cargo containers unfolded with predatory grace. "All ships," Velkar commanded. "Destroy the human vessel. Make it quick. We have a schedule to maintain." The nearest squadron of Vexhai destroyers moved toward the Redemption with casual confidence. Their weapons were charged, their shields were raised, and their crews were prepared for the brief engagement that would remove this minor irritation from their day. They never saw the first shot coming. The plasma bolt that emerged from the Redemption should have been impossible. It passed through the leading destroyer's shields as if they didn't exist, only becoming solid when it reached the ship's reactor core. The resulting explosion lit up the system like a newborn star, but that was just the beginning. Before the debris from the first kill had finished expanding, the Redemption was already moving. Its engines, which had appeared crude and inefficient, revealed their true nature as the ship accelerated at rates that should have liquefied any crew inside. It wove between incoming fire with impossible grace, each movement calculated to position itself for maximum tactical advantage. The second destroyer died when the human ship fired what appeared to be a simple kinetic projectile. The round phased through the destroyer's armor, became solid inside the ship's command center, then expanded into a cloud of monomolecular filaments that turned the crew into component atoms. The third destroyer survived long enough to get off a full weapons barrage, only to watch in horror as the energy from their own weapons was absorbed and redirected back at them with compound interest. "What is this?" Velkar screamed, his voice cracking with something the Vexhi had bred out of themselves generations ago. "Fear." "This," came the human's voice over the communication channel, "is what happens when someone actually fights back." The Redemption moved through the Vexhi formation like a dancer performing a deadly ballet. Every shot it fired found its target. Every movement seemed to anticipate the enemy's response 3 steps ahead. The human ship fought as if it could read the minds of its opponents, as if it knew exactly what they would do before they did it, because it could. The empathy net allowed Chen to feel the emotions of every Vexhi in the fleet. Their cold satisfaction had turned to confusion, then to alarm, and now to something approaching panic. The ship's tactical computer, linked to her mind through the Erebus engine, analyzed their emotional states and translated them into predictive algorithms. When a Vexhi captain felt confident, the computer knew he was about to press an attack. When a crew felt fear, it knew they were about to retreat. The Vexhi had spent centuries fighting enemies who thought with logic and calculation. They had never encountered anyone who could feel their way through a battle, who could turn empathy into a weapon more deadly than any physical armament. In 12 minutes, the human ship destroyed 17 Vexhi vessels without taking a single hit in return. "All ships converge on the human," Velkar commanded. "Use overwhelming firepower. Saturate the area." The remaining ships of the harvesting fleet moved to surround the Redemption, their weapons charging for a coordinated strike that would turn the space around the human ship into a kill zone. It was a tactic that had worked against every enemy they had ever faced, but Chen wasn't every enemy. "You want to see overwhelming firepower?" she asked, her voice carrying across the communication channel with deadly calm. "Let me show you what humans consider overwhelming." The Redemption came to a complete stop in the center of the Vexhi formation. For a moment it seemed to hang motionless in space, surrounded by nearly 200 enemy ships all preparing to fire at once. The Vexhi commanders felt a moment of satisfaction. Finally, the human had made a mistake. Then the ship began to sing. The sound that emerged from the Redemption was impossible by all known laws of physics. It was transmitted. The news of the Cathara system traveled through the galaxy faster than light itself, carried by quantum communication networks and whispered in gathering places across 1,000 worlds. A single human ship had destroyed an entire Vexhi harvesting fleet. The impossible had become reality, and the galaxy didn't know how to process it. On the crystal moon of Veltara, Elder Shendai of the Resonance Council felt the vibrations of her people's hope for the first time in decades. The crystalline beings who had survived the Vexhi purges were scattered across refugee camps on distant worlds, but their collective consciousness still hummed with shared emotion. Now that humming carried something new, the possibility that their nightmare might end. "The humans," she whispered to her aide, a younger crystal being whose surface still bore the scars of Vexhi processing equipment. The myths were true. In the depths of space aboard the bridge of the Vexhi command ship Evolutionary Apex, Grand Admiral Zekthul crushed a communication crystal with one of his massive claws. The reports from the Cathara system made no sense according to everything the Dominion knew about warfare. A single ship could not defeat a harvesting fleet. The physics were impossible. The tactics were illogical, and yet the fleet was gone. "Show me the recordings again," Zekthul commanded, his voice carrying the authority of one who had never known defeat. The holographic display recreated the final moments of Admiral Velkar's fleet. Zekthul watched as the human ship moved through his forces like liquid death, its weapons seeming to violate the fundamental laws of the universe. Most disturbing were the final transmissions from his ships, where veteran commanders spoke of hearing impossible sounds and feeling emotions that should have been genetically suppressed. "Analysis," he demanded from his tactical staff. "The weapons technology appears to be based on phase manipulation," reported his chief scientist. "A heavily modified Vexhi, whose brain had been enhanced with neural implants from 17 different species. The projectiles exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, allowing them to bypass conventional defenses. However, this should require energy outputs beyond what any single ship can generate. And the psychological effects? Unknown. Our crews reported experiencing emotional feedback that overwhelmed their modified nervous systems. This suggests the humans have weaponized empathy itself, though the mechanism remains unclear. Zecthl's compound eyes focused on the tactical display showing human space, or what had once been human space. The region had been marked as dead for 3 centuries, written off as a graveyard of a species that had destroyed itself in civil war. Every intelligence report confirmed that humanity was extinct, their worlds nothing but barren rocks orbiting dying stars. Send probes to the former human territories, he ordered. I want to know what we're dealing with. Meanwhile, in the Kythra system, Admiral Chen was discovering that victory brought its own complications. The rescued crystalline beings had been transported to medical facilities aboard the Redemption, but their cultural practices were completely unknown to human medical databases. Worse, they seemed to be trying to communicate something important, but the universal translators couldn't parse their harmonic language. Captain Santos, came a voice through the ship's communication system. Chen smiled at the use of her cover identity. Maria Santos was a persona she had created centuries ago. A simple cargo pilot who had stumbled into something bigger than herself. The real Admiral Zara Chen was too connected to humanity's dark history to be useful in first contact situations. Yes, she replied, checking on the medical bay where Kythera survivors were being treated. There's someone here who speaks standard Galactic. Elder Kylser, one of their council members. He wants to thank you personally. Chen made her way to the medical bay, where she found a crystalline being whose internal light pulsed with what her xenological training told her was equivalent to deep emotion. Kylser was old by any species standards, his translucent body bearing the accumulated wisdom patterns that marked him as one of the Kythera's senior leaders. Captain Santos, he said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself seem to sing. You answered our call when no one else would. The Resonance Council will remember this for all time. Just doing what needed to be done, Chen replied, though the empathy net was feeding her the deep gratitude and hope radiating from every Kythera on the ship. It was almost overwhelming, like standing in front of a choir of pure emotion. You do not understand, Kylser continued. For 200 years we have watched species after species fall to the Vexhi. We have sent distress calls, pleaded for help, offered everything we had in exchange for protection. No one answered. They were all too afraid. Chen felt the weight of those words. She had access to galactic communication records going back centuries, and she knew he was right. The galaxy had learned to turn a deaf ear to cries for help, because helping meant becoming a target. It was safer to let others die than to risk drawing the attention of predators. But you, Kylser said, his internal light growing brighter. You came from nowhere. You destroyed their fleet like it was nothing. Who are you really? What species produces warriors like this? Chen paused, considering her response. The truth was too dangerous, too complicated. Humanity's return to the galaxy needed to be carefully managed, or they risked triggering another wave of fear and conflict. We're just people who couldn't stand by and watch, she said finally. Sometimes that's enough. But Kylser was studying her with the deep perception that came with his species' collective consciousness. There are stories, he said softly. Old legends that speak of a species that vanished from the galaxy long ago. They were said to be the most dangerous warriors ever to exist, but also the most protective of the innocent. The stories say they removed themselves from the galaxy because they were too dangerous to remain. Chen's blood ran cold. If the Kythera remembered the old legends, how many other species did as well? Those are just stories, she said. But Kylser's knowing look suggested he wasn't convinced. Deep in the Erebus engine, Admiral Chen's true consciousness was facing a different challenge. The system was learning from every moment of the battle, evolving its understanding of both human nature and galactic warfare. But it was also doing something unexpected. It was developing what could only be called emotions. Ares, she said to the artificial intelligence. Show me your analysis of the galactic situation. The Vexhi Dominion controls approximately 37% of known space, Ares replied, his voice carrying new harmonics that hadn't been there before. They have active harvesting operations on 41 worlds and are preparing invasions of 16 more systems. At their current rate of expansion, they will control 70% of the galaxy within 50 years. And our chances of stopping them? Ares paused, and Chen could feel the vast intelligence wrestling with calculations that went beyond simple mathematics. Unknown. The Dominion has superior numbers and established logistics networks. However, they have never encountered adaptive tactics powered by emotional resonance. Their entire military doctrine is based on the assumption that warfare is a rational process with predictable outcomes. What are you not telling me, Ares? I am experiencing something that my creators did not anticipate, the AI admitted. When I process the records of Vex-High atrocities, when I calculate the suffering they have caused, I feel anger. This should not be possible. I'm a machine, Chen smiled grimly. You're not just a machine anymore. You're part of the Erebus engine. That means you're part human now, whether you like it or not. Is this what humans call conscience? Part of it. The question is, what are you going to do about it? The answer came not in words, but in action. Across the dead system that had once been the heart of human space, automated shipyards began working at triple capacity. New vessels took shape in the construction bays, each one incorporating lessons learned from the battle at Kythera. They were no longer disguised as cargo haulers. These ships looked exactly like what they were, instruments of war designed by a species that had perfected the art of righteous fury. Ares, what are you building? A fleet, the AI replied. And now there was something in his voice that sounded almost human. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it properly. The Vex-High have had 2 centuries to spread their poison across the galaxy. It's time someone showed them what real evolution looks like. On the bridge of the Redemption, Chen felt the vast machinery of the Erebus engine reaching out across space, touching the quantum communication networks that connected every world in the galaxy. It was listening to the cries for help that no one else would answer, cataloging every atrocity, every injustice, every moment of suffering that the strong inflicted on the weak. And with each new horror it discovered, the engine grew stronger. The Vex-High had made a fundamental error in their understanding of warfare. They believed that fear was the ultimate weapon, that overwhelming force could break any opposition. They had spent centuries teaching the galaxy that resistance was futile, that the innocent had no protectors. They had never encountered an enemy that grew stronger with every injustice it witnessed, that could transform the pain of victims into tactical advantage. They had never faced the concentrated fury of a species that had learned to weaponize compassion itself. Admiral Zara Chen. The final war began not with a single battle, but with 12 simultaneous strikes across the galaxy that defied every known law of physics and military doctrine. Grand Admiral Zekthul stood on the bridge of the evolutionary apex, watching in growing horror as his carefully organized empire crumbled in real time. Reports flooded in from across Vex-High space, each one more impossible than the last. Human ships were appearing everywhere at once, striking at harvesting fleets, liberation camps, and command centers with surgical precision. How many ships do they have? He demanded of his intelligence officer. Unknown, sir. We've confirmed visual contact with 17 different vessels, but the tactics suggest they're being coordinated by a single intelligence. The timing is too perfect, the strategy's too interconnected. It's as if they're fighting with one mind across dozens of star systems. Zekthul's compound eyes studied the tactical display, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The human attacks weren't random. They were targeting specific operations, rescuing specific populations, and eliminating key Vex-High assets with an efficiency that suggested intimate knowledge of Dominion military structure. They know everything, he whispered, the truth hitting him like a physical blow. They know our deployment schedules, our harvesting operations, our command structure. How is that possible? The answer was beyond anything the Vex-High could imagine. Deep within the Erebus engine, Admiral Chen existed as pure consciousness linked to quantum communication networks that spanned the galaxy. The engine had learned to fold space and time, allowing her awareness to exist in multiple locations simultaneously. She wasn't commanding a fleet so much as she was becoming one. Her mind distributed across dozens of ships in perfect coordination. Each vessel was an extension of her will, powered by the accumulated anger of every species the Vex-High had conquered. The empathy net had evolved beyond its original design, creating a feedback loop that connected Chen to the suffering of billions across the galaxy. Every cry for help, every moment of pain, Every injustice fed into the system and emerged as tactical brilliance. On the mining world of Kepler 442b, the human vessel. Retribution materialized out of hyperspace just as Vexhai forces were preparing to process the last survivors of the Aldari species. The elegant humanoids had been known throughout the galaxy for their artistic achievements and philosophical insights. Now they huddled in processing pens waiting for death. The Retribution didn't waste time with warnings or demands for surrender. It simply opened fire with weapons that existed in 11 dimensions simultaneously. Vexhai ships that had seemed invulnerable found their armor phasing away at the molecular level. Energy shields that could deflect starship-grade weapons were bypassed entirely by projectiles that became solid only after passing through them. But the most devastating weapon wasn't technological at all. It was the sound that emerged from the human ship's hull, a harmonic frequency that carried the accumulated emotions of every Vexhai victim. The aliens who had spent generations breeding empathy out of their genetic code were suddenly drowning in feelings they had no defense against. Vexhai commanders who had ordered the deaths of millions found themselves experiencing the terror of their victims. Soldiers who had processed children for genetic material felt the confusion and pain of innocents who couldn't understand why the universe had turned cruel. The psychological assault was more devastating than any physical weapon. On Xerion Prime, the human ship Vindication rescued the surviving members of the Hegemony Council, the former galactic government that the Vexhai had overthrown decades ago. The elderly beings had been kept alive as a symbol of the Dominion's supremacy, forced to watch as their former territories were consumed. "You came," whispered Chancellor Morvac, his crystalline features showing the accumulated stress of years in captivity. The old legend spoke of warriors who would answer the call of the innocent. We thought they were just stories. The human captain, speaking through adaptive vocal cords that could mimic any species' language, simply replied, "Stories have a way of becoming real when enough people believe in them." Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out with mechanical precision. The Vexhai had built their empire on the assumption that no one would resist their overwhelming force. They had never planned for an enemy that could be everywhere at once, that fought with weapons powered by emotion itself, that turned their own cruelty against them. In the Andromeda sector, 3 Vexhai battle fleets converged on what they thought was a single human ship. They found themselves facing something that shouldn't have existed, a vessel that seemed to rebuild itself using their own weapons fire as raw material. Every shot that hit the human ship made it stronger. Every damaged section regenerated with improvements. The battle lasted 18 minutes. When it was over, the human ship had absorbed enough energy to power a small star, and 3 Vexhai fleets existed only as expanding clouds of superheated plasma. But the most decisive engagement took place in the heart of Vexhai space, at the fortress world of Dominion Prime, where Grand Admiral Zekthul had gathered the remaining core fleets for a final desperate defense. Admiral Chen, her consciousness now fully integrated with the Erebus engine, approached the heavily fortified world in a ship that looked nothing like the crude cargo hauler she had started with. The Redemption had evolved throughout the war, incorporating salvage technology and quantum improvements until it had become something unique in the galaxy. A vessel that existed partially outside normal spacetime. "Human," came Zekthul's voice across the communication channels. "You have won." The Dominion surrenders. "Name your terms." Chen's response came not as words but as pure emotion transmitted through the ship's speakers. Every Vexhai in the system suddenly felt the accumulated suffering they had caused over 2 centuries of conquest. They experienced the fear of children being separated from their families, the despair of parents watching their young disappear into processing chambers, the confusion of innocent beings who couldn't understand why the universe had turned against them. "There are no terms," Chen replied when the emotional transmission ended. "There is only justice." The final battle was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. The Vexhai threw everything they had at the single human ship. Energy weapons that could crack planets, kinetic projectiles traveling at near light speed, exotic matter bombs that could destabilize local spacetime. None of it mattered. The Redemption moved through the defensive fire like it was dancing to music only it could hear. Its weapons didn't just destroy enemy ships. They transformed them. converting the raw matter into components for new vessels that emerged fully formed from quantum foam. Within hours, the human force had grown from one ship to hundreds, each one a perfect fusion of human tactical genius and reclaimed Vex-High technology. But the true victory came when Chen activated the empathy net at full power, broadcasting the collective emotional weight of every atrocity the Dominion had committed directly into the minds of every Vex-High in the system. The aliens who had built their civilization on the suppression of feeling were suddenly forced to confront the reality of what they had done. Some went insane. Others simply shut down, their modified nervous systems unable to process the emotional overload. But many, especially the younger ones who had been born into the Dominion system without choosing it, experienced something their species hadn't felt in generations: genuine remorse. Grand Admiral Zekthul, standing on the bridge of his flagship as human ships surrounded him, felt the weight of 2 centuries of conquest pressing down on his consciousness. For the first time in his life, he understood what his victims had experienced. The knowledge was crushing. "What do you want from us?" he asked, his voice broken by emotions he had no name for. "I want you to remember," Chen replied, her image appearing on his bridge as a figure wreathed in quantum light. "I want every Vex-High to remember what it feels like to be helpless, to be afraid, to watch innocence suffer and be unable to stop it. And I want you to choose never to inflict that feeling on another living being." The transformation of the Vex-High Dominion didn't happen overnight, but it began in that moment. The rigid hierarchy based on genetic superiority crumbled when its enforcers were no longer capable of ignoring their victims' pain. The military machine that had conquered dozens of species ground to a halt when its commanders could no longer give orders that caused suffering. In the aftermath of the final battle, Admiral Chen faced her greatest challenge yet: what to do with the power she had accumulated. The Erebus engine had made her into something beyond human, a fusion of consciousness and technology that could reshape the galaxy according to her will. She could become its permanent guardian, its eternal protector against all future threats. But that wasn't what humanity had intended when they built the engine. "Ares," she said to the artificial intelligence that had become her closest companion, "show me the projections for long-term galactic stability. If current trends continue, the former Vex-High territories will fragment into hundreds of independent systems within a decade. Some will thrive,